In 1967, Muhammad Ali refused to fight in Vietnam and lost everything: his title, his freedom, his prime years, all to stand on principle. This is the true story of Muhammad Ali. Chapter 1. Born to Fight. Born to Fight, Louisville, Kentucky in the winter of 1942 was not a place that advertised its beauty. It was a city of tobacco warehouses and church bells, of broad brown rivers and narrower possibilities, divided as cleanly as a cut deck of cards between those who held power and those who were expected to endure the lack of it. Jim Crow did not announce himself with a villain's cackle. He lived in the ordinary architecture of everyday life: the water fountain on the left, the water fountain on the right, the sign above each that told you everything you needed to know about where you stood in the American story. It was into this world that Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr. arrived on January 17, 1942. He did not arrive quietly. By most accounts, the boy came into the room with an enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the occasion, which is to say, he cried like a man who had strong opinions and intended to share them. Nobody in that Louisville hospital room could have known, of course, that the lungs they were hearing would one day recite poetry on national television, trash talk world champions into psychological rubble, and deliver a single sentence, "I am the greatest," that would ring through decades like a struck bell. His father, Cassius Marcellus Clay Sr., was a sign painter, a good one. He had the kind of steady hand that could letter a shop window in gold paint with the precision of a machine, and the kind of restless personality that made sitting still seem personally offensive. Cassius Sr. was charming, loud, funny, and combustible, a man who could fill a room with laughter and empty it with an argument. He had opinions on everything and the volume to prove it. If you are looking for where his son got the mouth, the lineage is not mysterious. The apple, as they say, did not fall far from the tree, and then rolled down the hill, picked up speed, and became something neither tree nor hill could entirely explain. Odessa Clay, the boy's mother, was a different instrument entirely. Where Cassius Sr. burned, Odessa warmed. She kept the house on Grand Avenue the way a conductor keeps an orchestra, quietly in command, correcting the tempo, making sure the whole enterprise stayed on the rails. She was a domestic worker, steady and gentle, a woman who moved through the indignities of segregated Louisville with a dignity that never shrank and never flinched. Her faith was genuine, her patience was structural, and her love for her boys, Cassius Jr. and his younger brother Rudy, was the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it simply never leaves the room. The neighborhood they grew up in was working-class black Louisville, which meant it had the warmth of a tight community and the weight of a system designed to keep that community compressed. Schools were segregated, neighborhoods were segregated. Ambition, if you had too much of it in the wrong skin, was considered a kind of social disturbance. The message from the broader architecture of American life was consistent and deliberate: know your place, stay in it, and be grateful the boundaries are only invisible. Young Cassius Clay received this message and, by all available evidence, found it hilarious. Not naively, he was not a child insulated from the reality of what Jim Crow meant. He saw it, he felt it, and people who knew him then say it registered. But something in the wiring of this particular boy converted the signal. Where the system intended diminishment, he produced defiance. Where it produced invisibility, he generated spectacle. From a startlingly early age, Cassius Clay seemed to be operating on the working theory that the loudest person in the room is the hardest to ignore. He was fast. Not just physically, though that too. He was one of those children who seems to have been issued extra gears, always moving, always running somewhere, usually somewhere he probably shouldn't have been. He was fast in the way he thought, fast in the way he talked, fast in the way he moved from idea to idea with a kind of electric momentum that left the adults around him slightly exhausted and quietly entertained. His smile was something people mentioned specifically even from those early years. Not a polite smile or a calculated one, but the blazing, full-on, entirely unguarded kind that made strangers feel like they'd been let in on a private joke. It was a weapon, that smile, though he didn't know it yet. It would serve him later in ways that a left jab couldn't. Charming presidents and reporters and television audiences who came expecting a brute and found instead something closer to a force of nature in a good mood. In school, Cassius was not distinguished by his academic performance. Reading gave him trouble, a fact he would later acknowledge without shame, though school did little to formally address it. What he had instead was an almost theatrical gift for social performance. He could read a room, read a crowd, read a person's temperature in seconds, and an internal combustion of energy that made sitting at a desk feel like a form of mild punishment. Teachers remembered him, not always fondly, but they remembered him, which is its own kind of grade. What Louisville had in 1942 and in the decade that followed was a city full of people living small lives in the shadow of large restrictions. Most of them did what people do under those conditions. They adapted, they endured, they found joy where they could and swallowed the rest. It was not weakness that made them do this, it was the arithmetic of survival. But every so often, a particular combination of circumstances and temperament and sheer stubborn voltage produces a person who doesn't do the arithmetic that way. A person who looks at the wall and instead of measuring how thick it is, starts calculating where to throw the first punch. Nobody standing in that hospital in January of 1942 looking at a newborn boy with a round face and a considerable opinion about the temperature of the room could have put any of this into words. How could they have known that the child screaming in that crib in segregated Louisville was going to grow into a man who would make the whole world stop and watch? That this boy, born into an America that had built entire systems to make him small, was going to spend his life being magnificently, impossibly, defiantly large? They couldn't have known, but looking back now, the clues were there from the very first breath. Chapter 2. The Stolen Bicycle. The bicycle was red. That detail matters, because Cassius Clay loved that bicycle the way 12-year-olds love things that represent everything: freedom, speed, the particular joy of moving through the world faster than your legs alone could carry you. He had ridden it to the Louisville home show at Columbia Auditorium that October day in 1954, along with a friend drawn in by the free popcorn and soft drinks being handed out inside. It was exactly the kind of afternoon that should have ended with nothing more dramatic than a stomachache. He came back outside and the bicycle was gone. Gone. Just gone. Some stranger had looked at that red bicycle and decided it was theirs now, and young Cassius stood on the sidewalk with his fists clenching and unclenching, running through every version of what he was going to do when he found the person responsible. He was not a small boy. He was not a quiet boy. And right now he was absolutely furious. Someone pointed him toward a police officer in the basement of the building, a man named Joe Martin who was taking a report. Cassius found him and launched immediately into a declaration of intent. He was going to find whoever stole his bicycle, and he was going to beat them up. He said this with total conviction, the way only an outraged 12-year-old can, as if the plan were fully formed and entirely reasonable. Joe Martin listened. Then he looked at the boy in front of him. Martin was not just a police officer. He also ran a boxing gym in the basement of the Columbia Gym, a place where Louisville boys came to learn how to throw a proper punch rather than just talk about it. He had seen a lot of tough kids come through his door, and he had learned to tell the difference between bluster and something real. He told Cassius, calmly and without drama, that if he wanted to beat somebody up, he had better first learn how to fight. It was not the response Cassius was expecting. He had come in breathing fire, ready for sympathy or at least a police report, and instead he got practical advice. There was something almost funny about it. This big proclamation about revenge met with a shrug and an invitation, but something about it landed differently than a dismissal would have. Martin wasn't mocking him. He was taking him seriously in the most concrete possible way. Cassius showed up at the gym. Within a matter of weeks, it was clear to everyone working there that something unusual had walked through the door. Most boys who came to learn boxing were timid at first, awkward, moving like they were apologizing for taking up space in the ring. Cassius was not like that. He moved constantly, talked constantly, and trained with an intensity that seemed almost alarming in someone his age. He wasn't just working hard, he was working like he was running out of time, like there was somewhere he absolutely had to be and boxing was the road there. Martin later said the boy was pound for pound one of the most dedicated young fighters he had ever seen, and he had seen a lot. There's something almost comic in the full picture of it, that one of the greatest athletes who ever lived found his calling because someone swiped a bicycle. No grand destiny announced from above, no obvious sign that history was shifting, just a kid, a stolen bike, and a chance conversation in a building basement. Cassius didn't walk in looking for purpose. He walked in looking for justice, specifically the street-level variety, and stumbled into something that would define the next 6 decades of his life. What the gym gave him, beyond the technical education, was a place where his energy made sense. Cassius Clay had always been loud, restless, constantly moving, the kind of kid who might generously be described as a handful. In school, he was not a standout student. At home, he wore his parents down with his sheer relentlessness. But inside those ropes, every bit of that frenetic electricity had a purpose. Speed was not a problem to manage. Speed was the whole point. He absorbed the fundamentals with frightening speed. His footwork developed into something that looked less like a fighting technique and more like a personal language, a way of moving through space that seemed to belong to no one else. Trainers noticed that he kept his hands lower than conventional wisdom suggested, a habit that should have left him exposed, and yet the hands never seemed to be where opponents expected them, and neither did his head. He was learning even at 12 to create angles that simply shouldn't have been available.
He ran before school. He ran after. He sparred until his arms felt like wet rope and then asked for one more round. Some nights he went home with his lips swollen and his ribs aching and told his mother he had bumped into something. She probably believed it the first time. Martin entered him in local amateur bouts, and Cassius began winning.
Not always cleanly, not always impressively, but he was winning, which is how a 12-year-old with a lot of raw material becomes a 13-year-old with a little bit of real skill. The stolen bicycle receded into the background. The thief was never found, never confronted, never subjected to the promised beating. In the end, whoever took that bicycle may have done young Cassius the strangest possible favor. A boy who set out furious and empty-handed came home with something worth far more than a red bicycle: a fighter's identity, a coach who saw what he could become, and a hunger that, once lit, showed no signs of burning itself out. The gym became his world, and the world had better start paying attention. Chapter 3. The Louisville Lip. Rome in the summer of 1960 was everything Louisville was not: ancient, golden, buzzing with cameras and foreign voices and the intoxicating idea that the whole planet was watching. Cassius Clay, 18 years old, lean as a whip and twice as fast, walked into that city and immediately started talking. He told anyone who would listen that he was going to win the gold medal. He told his roommates. He told journalists who barely spoke English. He walked the Olympic Village like a man who already owned it, shaking hands, cracking jokes, memorizing faces, cataloging names from countries he'd never seen on a map. The other athletes thought he was entertaining. His coaches thought he was a handful. They were both right. Then he fought, and suddenly no one was laughing at the spectacle anymore. In the light heavyweight division, Clay moved in ways that made his opponents look like they were boxing underwater. He didn't just beat them, he made them look confused, like a man who shows up to a chess match and finds his opponent has already rearranged the board. 3 bouts, 3 wins. And in the gold medal final against Zbigniew Pietraszkowski of Poland, a decorated, experienced southpaw who had won a bronze medal 4 years prior, Clay put on a third round that the crowd in the Palazzo dello Sport simply could not believe. He landed combinations so fast they barely registered as individual punches. The judges awarded him the gold unanimously. Cassius Clay stood on that podium and felt something enormous move through him, something that had no name yet but would define the next 60 years of his life. The American flag went up. He bit the medal, grinned for every camera pointed at him, and thought, for a moment, that was entirely private, that everything was finally beginning. He came home to Louisville a conquering hero, and the city staged a dinner in his honor. He wore the medal everywhere, to the grocery store, to church, to bed, according to at least one cousin who may or may not have been exaggerating. People stopped him on the street, white people even. They shook his hand and said they'd watched him on television, said he'd made them proud. For a week or two, the gold medal felt like a magic talisman, a key that had finally clicked into a door that had always been locked. Then he walked into a Louisville restaurant and sat down, and they told him they didn't serve Negroes just like that. The Olympic gold medalist fresh off international television, a boy who had spent 2 weeks being cheered by the world, was told to leave. The medal was right there around his neck. It didn't matter. The Jim Crow logic of the American South was not impressed by Rome. It was not moved by television coverage. It did not negotiate with gold. What Ali did next depends on who's telling the story. The version that hardened into legend, and Ali himself told it more than once, is that he walked to the Ohio River and threw the medal in. Gone. Let the river have it. What use was a gold medal in a country that wouldn't serve you a sandwich? Historians and journalists have picked at the story for decades. There are those who doubt it. His trainer at the time gave conflicting accounts. Ali's own telling shifted slightly in the retelling, the way true stories sometimes do when they've been carried long enough. Whether or not the medal actually hit that water, the gesture was real in every way that mattered. It captured something exact and true about how it felt to be celebrated and then humiliated in the same breath. To be good enough for the world stage, but not for a lunch counter. That's not a story you need to embroider. That's just America in 1960. And Cassius Clay, whatever grief or fury moved through him in private, came out the other side doing what he always did, performing. He started writing poems. Not careful, considered verse. Fast, jabbing rhymes that doubled as prophecy. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee was already forming in that restless brain. He'd predict the round he'd knock an opponent out, then put it in verse, then deliver it to any microphone in range. The press called him loud, called him a braggart, called him a loudmouth kid who needed to be taught humility. What they couldn't figure out was that the bragging and the boxing were the same thing. The mouth was the jab. The poem was the setup. The fight was the punchline. He was not, underneath all of it, entirely without fear. People who trained alongside him in those years remembered a young man who worked himself to exhaustion in the gym, who replayed his fights obsessively, who wanted to know everything his opponents could do and then spent hours devising an answer. The confidence was real, but it wasn't casual. It was constructed deliberately, punch by punch, rhyme by rhyme. He was building something, and he knew it, even if he couldn't yet name what it was going to be. But what made Cassius Clay something genuinely new was that he understood, intuitively, years before anyone used the phrase sports media, that attention was power, that the television camera wasn't just a record of a fight, it was an arena of its own. He could win rounds before he ever stepped between the ropes. He could control the story. He could be so interesting, so electric, so aggressively present that the world could not look away even when it wanted to. He was funny. That deserves to be said plainly because it gets lost sometimes in the weight of everything that came later. He was genuinely, improvisationally funny, quick and warm and willing to be absurd in service of the joke. He made people laugh and then, while they were laughing, said something that lodged in the brain like a splinter. Sports writers who covered him in those early years would admit, privately, that filing copy after a Cassius Clay press conference was the easiest thing they ever did. He handed you the quotes pre-assembled. He gave you the headline before you asked the question. He was, as one journalist put it, the only fighter who was already more famous than the championship he hadn't yet won. By the time he was 21, Cassius Clay had become the kind of person who changes the temperature of a room just by entering it, a presence so vivid and so loud and so alive that the world was already leaning forward, waiting to see what he would say next, and waiting, underneath all the noise and poetry and spectacle, to see if he could truly back it up. He could. Chapter 4. Shocking the World. The morning of February 25, 1964, the smart money was on Cassius Clay getting destroyed. Not just losing, destroyed. Sonny Liston was the most feared heavyweight on the planet, a man who had dismantled Floyd Patterson twice, both times in the first round, both times so efficiently it barely seemed like boxing. Sports writers weren't giving Clay a prayer. One wire service poll of boxing reporters came back with exactly 0 votes for the challenger. Odds makers installed Liston as a 7-1 favorite. 7-1. The pre-fight medical team at Convention Hall in Miami Beach was quietly instructed to have extra equipment on standby. For Clay, everyone expected a short, ugly night. Clay naturally had other plans, and he was not keeping them quiet. In the weeks leading up to the fight, he had haunted Liston's morning runs, driven a bus to his house at 2 in the morning honking the horn, called him a big ugly bear in verse that actually rhymed, and predicted the round of the knockout with the serene confidence of a man reading a calendar. The press called it clowning. The public thought he had lost his mind. Liston, for his part, looked at Clay the way a man looks at a mosquito, mildly annoyed, certain of the outcome. But here is what almost nobody understood about Cassius Clay in the winter of 1964. The noise was real, but the preparation was realer. His trainer, Angelo Dundee, knew it. Clay was rising before dawn, running in the dark, working combinations that moved faster than the eye could track. The clowning was strategy. Keep Liston irritated, keep him thinking he's fighting a showboat, keep him from studying what was actually coming for him in that ring. When the bell rang for round 1, something shifted. The arena felt it before it could articulate it. Clay came out moving, not backpedaling, not running, but moving in the way a matador moves, purposeful and diagonal, angling away from Liston's left hook while setting up the jab. Liston threw and found air. He threw again, more air. You could almost see the confusion spreading across the champion's face like a slow stain. This was not what bears are supposed to do to mosquitoes. Clay's jab was a different instrument than anything Liston had encountered. It wasn't just fast. It was placed, it was timed, it arrived in little clusters that snapped Liston's head back before the big man could even begin to load the counter. Round 1 went to Clay. Round 2. Round 3. The crowd, which had bought tickets mostly to watch Clay get folded, started to lean forward. Then came round 4, and the night nearly went sideways. Between rounds, something got into Clay's eyes, likely liniment or caustic from Liston's gloves or corner work, and it burned like fire. He came back to the corner half blind, both eyes watering and screaming at Dundee that he couldn't see, that they needed to stop the fight. In that moment, for just a handful of seconds, the bravado evaporated entirely. He was a 22-year-old kid sitting on a stool, eyes streaming, telling his trainer he couldn't go back out there. Dundee didn't let him quit. He rinsed the eyes as best he could, shoved Clay off the stool with instruction to stay on the outside and let the eyes clear, and Clay did exactly that, moving, surviving, using his feet as his primary weapon for most of that round. By round 5, his vision was returning. By round 6, he was back. What Liston experienced in round 6 was the worst possible version of what he had already been living through, except now Clay smelled blood. The jab was back, the angles were back, and Liston, who had never in his professional career been required to chase someone for 6 full rounds, was exhausted in a way that seemed to embarrass him. His punches were losing their authority. His breathing was audible from the cheap seats. When the bell ended round 6, Liston sat on his stool and did not get up. The official report cited a shoulder injury, a damaged rotator cuff. What the ringside seats saw was a man who had simply run out of answers and had no interest in absorbing more punishment in search of ones that weren't coming. The referee crossed the ring, the announcement was made, and the building that had come to watch Cassius Clay get disassembled, exploded. Clay was in the ring before anyone could fully process what had happened, arms spread, turning in circles, looking for cameras, finding all of them. "I shook up the world," he screamed, and the sincerity behind it was total, the way only things that are completely true can be total. "I am the greatest." He was not performing anymore. He meant every syllable in the most literal way a person can mean something. He was also, it is worth noting, absolutely correct. At 22 years old, Cassius Clay had just beaten the man everyone said was unbeatable, using a style so fluid and unprecedented that boxing people would spend the next decade trying to reverse engineer it. The combination of his hand speed, his footwork, his lateral movement, his ring intelligence, none of it had ever been assembled in quite this configuration before. He made the sport look like something it had never been, balletic, cerebral, borderline arrogant in its beauty. One ringside commentator trying to find the words reportedly just said, "I don't know what I just watched." That was probably the most honest thing said in the building all night. The boxing world would spend years debating the shoulder, the circumstances, what was legitimate and what wasn't. None of it would change the scorecards. None of it would change what 70 million people had seen on closed-circuit television across the country. A young man from Louisville, Kentucky, written off by nearly every expert in the sport, had walked into that ring as the loudest long shot in recent memory and walked out as the heavyweight champion of the world. Standing in the ring at Convention Hall, still shouting, still turning, still looking every camera in the eye, Cassius Clay had proved something that went beyond sports. He had proved that sometimes the man everyone tells you is going to lose has simply not been informed of that fact, and that in the gap between what the world expects and what you know yourself to be, the most extraordinary things become possible. Chapter 5. I am Muhammad Ali. The press conference was already a circus before anyone said a word. It was February 27th, 1964, 2 days after the world had watched a 22-year-old dismantle the most feared man in boxing, and reporters packed into a Miami Beach hotel room expecting the new heavyweight champion of the world to show up, grin, wave around the belt, and say something quotable about his next opponent. They expected celebration. They expected the Louisville Lip doing what the Louisville Lip did. What they were not expecting was what actually happened. Malcolm X sat in the room, and every journalist in that place suddenly understood that this was not going to be a normal morning. Cassius Clay stepped to the front, calm in a way that was almost eerie compared to his usual electric showmanship. No rhymes this time, no floating butterfly theatrics. He spoke plainly. He was a member of the Nation of Islam. He believed in the religion. He would not be ashamed of it, and he would not be hiding it. The room went cold. Within days he went further. The name Cassius Marcellus Clay, a name inherited, he noted pointedly, from the white slaveholder who had owned his ancestors, was no longer his. He had been given a new name by Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. That name was Muhammad Ali. He said it with absolute finality, the way you close a door on a room you're never going back to. Cassius Clay is a slave name, he told reporters. I didn't choose it and I don't want it. I am Muhammad Ali, and you will use it when you speak to me. The establishment did not take this well. That might be the most generous possible understatement. Newspaper editors across the country held meetings, actual editorial meetings, to decide whether or not they would print the name Muhammad Ali in their publications. Many decided they would not. Sports columnists who had spent the previous 48 hours celebrating his stunning upset victory over Sonny Liston now sharpened their pens into something considerably less friendly. Jimmy Cannon, one of the most respected sports writers in America, called Ali's affiliation with the Nation of Islam the dirtiest in American sports. Others used worse language and didn't apologize for it. Sponsors who had been circling after the Liston win suddenly remembered pressing business elsewhere. The phone calls that had been pouring in went quiet. Endorsement conversations evaporated. There would be no cereal boxes, no soft drink campaigns, no mainstream American marketing machine throwing its weight behind this particular heavyweight champion. The heavyweight title, which was supposed to be a golden door opening, had, in the eyes of much of white America, swung shut the moment he said his name out loud, and Ali just kept saying it, every single day. Loudly, deliberately, with a kind of patient relentlessness that was its own form of power. When reporters called him Clay, he corrected them. When commentators called him Clay on television, he corrected them. When interviewers, some genuinely confused, some deliberately antagonizing, slipped the old name in, he would stop the conversation entirely. My name is Muhammad Ali. Call me by my name. The older boxing establishment, which had already been uncomfortable with his personality and his mouth and his refusal to be grateful and quiet in the ways they preferred, now had a name for what bothered them. Though their diagnosis said more about them than about him, he was, they said, a troublemaker, ungrateful, political in ways a prizefighter had no business being political. What they couldn't quite process was that Ali wasn't performing defiance. He wasn't doing this to sell tickets or generate headlines, though it did both. He genuinely believed the faith was real, the commitment was real, and the name was real. He had thought about this, sat with it, made peace with the cost, and decided. The decision had nothing to do with them. That, perhaps more than anything, is what unnerved people. The stillness underneath the storm. The man who had danced around Liston and shouted into cameras was, at his core on this particular matter completely unmovable. There were moments, in the quieter hours that few people ever heard about, when the weight of it settled on him differently. He was 22. He had just done the most extraordinary thing in boxing. He had been told his whole life that the championship, the glory, the recognition, was the prize at the end of the road. And here he was, holding it, watching half the world decide they didn't like what his hands looked like up close. That's a strange thing to sit with at 22 years old. But he sat with it, and then he kept going. Because the thing people fundamentally misunderstood about Muhammad Ali, and many would spend years getting wrong, was that he did not need their approval to feel real. He wasn't asking for validation. He was issuing a statement. His identity was his own business. His name was his own property. And no newspaper editor in New York or television producer in Los Angeles had any jurisdiction over either. That was the actual argument. Everything else, the controversy, the outrage, the op-eds, the dropped sponsorships, was just noise on the other side of a door he had already walked through. By the time the sports world was forced to slowly, grudgingly, eventually begin using the name Muhammad Ali, he had already been Muhammad Ali for years in his own head, in his home, in his prayers. The world's adjustment was its own problem. He had already moved on. What is easy to forget now, decades later, when Muhammad Ali is printed on postage stamps and enshrined in halls of fame and spoken by presidents, is how radical that insistence was in 1964. The name change was not a branding exercise. It was a man standing up in the middle of a country with very specific ideas about what black men were and were not permitted to claim for themselves, and saying, "No, my name is mine, my faith is mine, my identity is mine." No belt had been required for that fight, and no judges were going to score it. But it was, without question, the most important one he had ever entered. Chapter 6. The Exile. The United States government sent Muhammad Ali a piece of paper, and that piece of paper expected him to show up, raise his right hand, and become a soldier. Simple enough. Millions of young American men had done exactly that. The machinery of the draft was not designed to take no for an answer. Ali said no anyway. By April 1967, he was 25 years old and the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. He was also, by nearly every measure, the most famous athlete on the planet, a man whose face and voice could stop traffic in Cairo or Tokyo or London. Nobody needed to explain who Muhammad Ali was, you just knew. And yet, when he stepped into the armed forces examining an entrance station in Houston, Texas, on April 28th, he already understood that stepping back out the same man was not guaranteed. The induction process was standard and almost deliberately boring. Forms, lines, fluorescent lights, the low hum of bureaucracy. When the officer called the name Cassius Clay, Ali did not move. He was called again. Still nothing. He was then informed, with the stiff formality of government language, that refusing induction was a federal offense punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. He was given one more chance to step forward. He did not step forward. Outside, reporters were already pressed against the building like the walls might tell them something. Ali walked out and gave them what they came for. Not rage, not a trembling voice, but a calm so complete it seemed almost aggressive. He had said it before and would say it again, the line that cut through every political argument anyone tried to build around him, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." That sentence traveled around the world faster than any punch he had ever thrown. The establishment's response was swift and not remotely subtle. Within days, boxing commissions across the country revoked his license. The World Boxing Association stripped him of the heavyweight championship, a title he had never lost inside a ring. Passports were revoked. The man who could have filled any arena on earth was suddenly not allowed to work, not suspended, not fined, erased officially from the sport he had electrified for a decade. The logic driving the punishment was not hard to find. It was 1967. The Vietnam War was grinding through its worst years, and the government was not in the mood for high-profile dissent, especially not from a black Muslim champion with a gift for making headlines. An Ali who said no was more dangerous than an Ali who fought. They understood that, even if they would never quite say it plainly. What the commissions and the courts perhaps didn't fully anticipate was that Ali had already done the math himself. He wasn't operating on impulse. His religious beliefs as a member of the Nation of Islam prohibited him from participating in wars he considered unjust, and he was specific about why this war qualified. Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs? He wasn't hiding behind theology alone. He was naming a contradiction that millions of Americans, especially Black Americans, already felt in their bones but hadn't heard spoken so directly from someone impossible to dismiss. The criminal case moved toward trial, and in June 1967, a jury convicted him in less than 20 minutes. 20 minutes. 5 years of his life and his entire career hanging in the balance, and the jury needed less time than it takes to eat lunch. He was released on bail while the case worked through appeals, but the professional sentence had already been served. He was out, indefinitely, with no timeline and no promise of return. 3.5 years is a number that looks manageable written down. In athletic terms, it is a career. Ali turned 25 during the exile and would not fight professionally again until he was almost 29. The years between 25 and 29 for a heavyweight fighter are not decorative years. They are the years when reflexes are sharpest, when the body and the mind run at their closest to perfect alignment. Those years were gone, traded away for something he considered more important than championships. He was not silent during those years, which perhaps the boxing commissions hadn't fully planned for either. Ali took to college campuses speaking to students who were burning draft cards and marching against the same war, and he was extraordinary at it, funny, sharp, able to shift from laughter to gravity in a single breath. He was as charismatic on a lectern as he had ever been in a ring, and the audiences who came to watch a boxer often left feeling they had heard something they would carry the rest of their lives. The cultural ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet. By the late 1960s, the war's popularity was collapsing. Martin Luther King Jr. had spoken publicly against it. Veterans were coming home disillusioned. And the man who had said no first, the man who had paid the highest visible price for saying it, was still standing, unimprisoned, unbroken, and still very much talking. History has a way of catching up to people who were right early. In 1971, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in his favor unanimously, overturning his conviction. The justices found that the Justice Department had improperly advised his draft board. The legal threat dissolved. The ban on his boxing license had already been lifted the year before, and he had returned to the ring in October 1970, fighting and winning in Atlanta, one of the few states willing to grant him a license. But the Supreme Court ruling mattered beyond the legal relief it provided. It was the country, through its highest court, conceding that something had gone wrong. Not an apology, governments rarely do those cleanly, but an acknowledgement in the formal language of law that Ali had not simply been wrong and punished for it. He had been right, and it had cost him anyway. That is the part that never quite softened into comfortable mythology. He hadn't lost nothing and won everything. He had lost real years, real fights, a real piece of his physical prime that no court ruling and no public vindication could return to him. What the exile proved more than anything else was not just that Muhammad Ali had principles, but that he had actually meant them, because a man who is only performing conviction finds a quieter way out before the bill arrives. He never found a quieter way out. He paid in full, stood up straight afterward, and got back to work. Chapter 7. The Rumble and the Thriller. Kinshasa, Zaire, October 30th, 1974. 4 in the morning. Not a misprint. The fight was scheduled at 4 in the morning local time so that American television audiences could watch in prime time. Somewhere in that decision, the convenience of a distant audience trumping the sleep of an entire nation was a detail Ali would have found hilarious and infuriating in equal measure. He probably used it for motivation anyway. He used everything. George Foreman was 25 years old and had not lost a professional fight. He had destroyed Joe Frazier twice, knocking him down 6 times in 2 rounds, which is the kind of performance that doesn't just win a fight, it makes observers question whether Frazier was ever real. He had obliterated Ken Norton, who had broken Ali's jaw. Sports writers weren't just picking Foreman to win, they were quietly, genuinely worried about Ali's safety. Even members of Ali's own corner were afraid. That fear was not unreasonable. Ali, at 32, had been away from the sport for 3.5 years during his exile, and though he had returned and fought his way back to contention, the legs were not what they were in 1964. The pure, blurring speed of his youth had softened at the edges. What remained was something harder to measure: intelligence, will, and an almost supernatural ability to read another man's psychology. He read Foreman like a short book. The strategy Ali devised with trainer Angelo Dundee became one of the most famous in sports history, the rope-a-dope. Though in the days before the fight, nobody knew that was what he was planning. Ali certainly didn't announce it. He spent the pre-fight weeks doing what he always did: talking, performing, turning the entire country of Zaire into his personal theater. He dubbed Foreman the Mummy and did a lurching, stiff-armed impression of him for crowds that screamed with laughter. The Zairean people had already adopted Ali as one of their own, chanting Ali Bomaye, which translates roughly as Ali kill him, and his showmanship deepened that bond into something electric. Then the bell rang. Foreman came out throwing heavy, concussive shots, and Ali did something that looked, to everyone watching, like a catastrophic mistake. He backed onto the ropes and let Foreman hit him. Not once, not in a desperate scramble to survive. Deliberately, repeatedly, over round after round, Ali leaned against the ropes with his arms high, absorbing the shots on his gloves and forearms, whispering things in Foreman's ear, taunting him, laughing at him, asking if that was the hardest he could punch. "That all you got, George? That all you got?" Foreman was one of the hardest punchers in the history of heavyweight boxing. Having that man unload on you for 8 rounds, even with blocked shots, is not comfortable. Ali's corner was begging him to change tactics. Angelo Dundee later admitted he had no idea what Ali was doing and was terrified. But Ali knew exactly what he was doing. He was waiting. Foreman was enormous and powerful and had destroyed every man placed in front of him, but he had never been in deep water. He had never needed to reach for something extra in the late rounds because there had never been late rounds. And punching, real full-force punching, round after round against a man who won't go down, is exhausting in a way that's difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't tried it. By the 7th round, Foreman's arms were heavy. By the 8th, they were lead. Ali came off the ropes. A right hand, then a left, then another right. Combinations landing clean and fast, and Foreman went down in a way that looked less like a knockdown and more like a man whose strings had been cut. He was counted out. Muhammad Ali was heavyweight champion of the world again. The roar from the crowd in Kinshasa could probably have been heard from space. If the rumble in the jungle was Ali at his most brilliantly calculated, the thriller in Manila, October 1st, 1975, was Ali at his most mortal. His third fight with Joe Frazier was not a chess match. It was 2 men deciding in real time how much they were willing to endure for something that may have transcended sport entirely. Their relationship was complicated in ways that neither man could fully untangle from ego, pride, and genuine pain. Ali had called Frazier ugly, called him ignorant, called him a gorilla. Some of it was promotional theater. Some of it cut deeper than that, and Frazier never entirely forgave him. On fight night in the Philippine heat, the tension between them was not theatrical. It was real, and it was raw. The fight was savage from the opening bell. Frazier came forward behind that left hook that had haunted Ali since their first meeting, and Ali found the going brutal. He hurt Frazier badly in the middle rounds, staggered him, seemed to take control, and then Frazier came back. Again and again that hook. Again and again Frazier walked through punishment that would have stopped most men and kept pressing forward. By the 12th round, both men were suffering in ways the cameras could not fully capture. Ali, between rounds, reportedly told his corner he wanted to stop. He has spoken about this since, openly, without embarrassment. The moment he considered quitting, the moment the pain and exhaustion pressed against the outermost edge of what he could take. His corner talked him back. He went out for the 13th and the 14th. After the 14th round, Frazier's trainer Eddie Futch looked at his fighter, one eye nearly shut, legs unreliable, and stopped the fight. Frazier argued. Futch wouldn't budge. It was over. Ali collapsed on his stool and later called it the closest thing to dying he had ever known. He meant it. Both men left that ring diminished in body and enlarged in legend. What those two fights in Kinshasa and Manila accomplished together was something beyond the record books. They took Ali from the realm of the merely extraordinary, the fastest heavyweight, the most charismatic, the most controversial, and placed him somewhere else entirely. They showed a man who could absorb the worst that could be thrown at him, who could suffer and doubt and nearly break, and who could still find the thing inside himself that the occasion required. Sports produces champions regularly enough. It produces mythological figures almost never. By the end of 1975, Muhammad Ali was unambiguously the latter, a name that had outgrown boxing, outgrown sport, and settled into something that felt permanent, like geography. Chapter 8. The Long Goodbye. Nobody tells you what winning costs until the bill arrives. For Muhammad Ali, the invoice came slowly, then all at once. The hands that had thrown perhaps 50,000 punches in training and competition, hands that had embarrassed Sonny Liston, dismantled George Foreman, and survived Joe Frazier, began to tremble. The voice that had filled arenas, charmed television studios, and recited poetry to anyone within earshot started to thicken and slow, like a river running into mud. The man who had once moved faster than thought itself was finding that his own body had quietly changed the locks on him. By 1981, the year he officially retired, Muhammad Ali was 39 years old and carrying the accumulated weight of over 60 professional fights. His record stood at 56 wins and 5 losses, a ledger that looked heroic on paper. But records don't tell you about the punches that landed clean. They don't account for the rounds in Manila where he told his cornerman to cut off his gloves and was talked out of it. They don't measure what it cost a human brain to absorb that kind of punishment across 2 decades. The retirement itself was not exactly a triumphant curtain call. Ali's final 2 fights, a points loss to Larry Holmes in 1980 and a defeat to Trevor Berbick in 1981, were hard to watch for anyone who loved him. Holmes, a former sparring partner who genuinely did not want to hurt his old friend, later said the experience left him emotional for years. The Ali who entered those rings was not the Ali the world had memorized. The legs weren't there. The reflexes that had seemed supernatural, almost mocking, were gone. He was a great man trying to win a fight against time, and time, as always, does not negotiate. The diagnosis came in 1984, Parkinson's syndrome. Doctors were careful with the language. They called it a syndrome rather than the disease itself, but the symptoms were visible to anyone watching. The tremor in his left hand, the occasional shuffle in his walk, the soft, deliberate way he now spoke, as if each word had to be carefully retrieved from somewhere deep. Medical opinion was divided on the precise cause, and it always would be. Some researchers argued the link to boxing was direct and obvious. Others were more cautious. But the public and plenty of physicians looked at the punishment Ali had absorbed over a career that should have ended several fights earlier, and they drew their own conclusions. The sport that had made him a god had also exacted a price measured in neurological damage. What followed, though, was one of the more quietly remarkable acts of his life. Ali did not disappear. He did not retreat to a guarded estate and allow people to remember only the young, electric version of him. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that there were people who would love nothing more than to see Muhammad Ali diminished, to see the loud, defiant, beautiful inconvenience of him reduced to something small and pitiful. He declined to cooperate with that narrative. He showed up. He kept showing up. He appeared at public events, moved through crowds, shook hands, posed for photographs. He still had the smile, that enormous, mischievous, slightly dangerous smile, and he deployed it freely. When reporters would ask him about his health, he would sometimes pause just long enough to make them uncomfortable, and then flash that grin, as if he found the question faintly amusing. There was a version of him that clearly still enjoyed the theater of the thing, even now. His wife Lonnie, whom he had known since she was a child growing up near his Louisville home, became central to managing both his health and his public presence. She was sharp, organized, and fiercely protective in a way that Ali himself sometimes gently pushed against, because even now, he wanted to be the one in charge of his own story. Old habits. The Parkinson's slowed his speech, but it did not slow his conviction. Those who met him during these years often came away surprised. They expected tragedy and found instead a kind of settled certainty. He had been through enough to know who he was. The trembling hand belonged to a man who had stood in front of armies, governments, and the full machinery of American outrage and had not moved. A diagnosis was not going to move him either. It would be dishonest to pretend there was no cost to all of this, no private weight. People close to him noted the frustration of a man whose mind remained sharp, but whose body increasingly refused to perform on command. There were quiet moments, not for public consumption, not part of any performance, where the gap between who he had been and what he now navigated was simply present without resolution. He was human. He had earned the right to find it hard, but what he never did was surrender the floor to the illness. He treated his Parkinson's the way he had treated every opponent who was supposed to beat him, not with denial, but with a refusal to be defined by it. It was just another thing in the ring with him. He had beaten bigger things. By the mid-1980s, he was already moving toward the humanitarian work that would occupy the rest of his life, the part of the story still being written. The fighter was becoming something else, not less exactly, something that required a different word entirely. What the long goodbye taught anyone paying attention was that Muhammad Ali's greatest act of courage might not have been in Kinshasa or Manila or Miami. It might have been the quieter courage of continuing to be himself, fully and publicly, in a body that trembled, in a world that was watching to see if he would finally shrink. He never did. Chapter 9. A Torch for the World. The torch was supposed to be a secret. Organizers had spent months choreographing every inch of the 1996 Atlanta Olympics opening ceremony, routing the flame through a carefully staged relay of American icons. Janet Evans, the swimmer, was the last name the public knew about. Then the cauldron sat there, high above the stadium floor, and 80,000 people craned their necks wondering who came next. When the spotlight found Muhammad Ali, the crowd's gasp was so sudden and collective it sounded almost like a single word. He stepped forward, and the whole planet seemed to lean in at once. His left hand shook. It had been shaking for years by then, the tremor that came with Parkinson's syndrome, the stubborn electrical misfiring that had slowly rearranged the architecture of the most famous body in sports. He held the torch and it quivered with him, flame dancing in the Georgia night air, and for a moment nobody breathed. Billions of people watching on television understood simultaneously, in the gut rather than the brain, what they were seeing. The most physically dominant man of his generation standing before the world in the full, unguarded truth of his vulnerability, refusing as ever to look away from anything. He lit the cauldron, the flame climbed. The crowd erupted into something that wasn't quite cheering. It was closer to releasing, like a dam going, like everyone had been holding something they didn't know they were holding and could finally let it go. Ali smiled, and if you watched his face in that moment, you saw the fighter still entirely present in there. The joy still quick, the eyes still full of mischief even as his body staged its quiet rebellion. Later he would joke about it, because of course he would. He told interviewers that the torch was heavy and he was pretty sure they'd picked him specifically so nobody would notice the flame shaking. That was the thing about Ali. He could make you laugh precisely at the moments that had already made you cry, which is a kind of mercy most people never master. But the Atlanta ceremony was really just the most visible moment in a chapter of Ali's life that had been unfolding with less fanfare and more consequence for years. Long before Atlanta, Ali had begun working in a way that didn't photograph as dramatically as a heavyweight championship, in the grinding, unglamorous business of showing up where other famous people did not. He went to countries living through famine. He visited refugee camps. He walked into hospitals in impoverished communities where children recognized the face but had no frame of reference for what heavyweight champion of the world even meant. And he sat with them anyway, holding hands when words didn't travel. The globe is large and most of its suffering goes unwitnessed, but Ali was constitutionally incapable of averting his eyes. In 1990, with the Gulf crisis deepening and Saddam Hussein holding over a dozen American hostages in Iraq, Ali flew to Baghdad. The State Department was nervous. The situation was dangerous. Most rational observers considered the trip a long shot dressed up in famous footwear. Ali landed, met with Iraqi officials, and worked the room in the particular way only he could, not with diplomatic formality, but with presence, with the weight of a life lived so visibly and so stubbornly on principle that people in positions of power sometimes simply wanted to be near it. He came home with the hostages. 15 Americans walked off that plane because Muhammad Ali had decided it was worth the effort to ask. Think about that for a second. He didn't have a military, he didn't have a portfolio or a title or any legal standing whatsoever. What he had was a name that meant something everywhere on earth. Not just as an athlete, but as a man who had given things up for what he believed, and whom people therefore trusted in a way that transcended language, border, and politics. That trust was the currency he spent in Baghdad, and it was currency he had spent his whole adult life accumulating at considerable personal cost. The humanitarian work was not a second act or a late career pivot toward respectability. It was more like the same note he'd always been playing, just in a different register. When he refused the draft, he wasn't playing a character. He was someone who believed that the lives of people who didn't look like him or live like him were worth the trouble of his own suffering. That belief didn't evaporate when the cameras changed. It just took him to different rooms. There's a version of this story, a smaller, more comfortable version, in which Ali spent his later years accepting humanitarian awards in tuxedos and appearing at charity galas to add luster to the room. That version exists because he did those things too, and there is nothing wrong with those things. But the fuller version includes him on planes to disaster zones, standing in places no one would have blamed him for skipping, and using the last genuinely inexhaustible resource he had, his name, his face, what he represented, with a focus that never really dimmed. By the mid-1990s, no serious survey of global recognition found anyone who came close. Not athletes, not politicians, not film stars. Researchers would show photographs in rural villages in sub-Saharan Africa, in remote towns in the South American interior, in communities across Southeast Asia where English was a foreign language and American news traveled slowly, if at all. The face came back identified, every time, with the same name, Muhammad Ali. He had been stripped of a title once, he had been called a traitor, a coward, a disgrace. He had been denied the right to earn a living in the only profession he'd ever known. During the very years when that profession was his, he had stood on the other side of all of it, and what the world eventually decided, watching from every angle over 4 decades, was that the man in question had been right all along and had known it the whole time. The torch in Atlanta burned through the night, and so, in every sense that mattered, did he. Chapter 10. The Greatest Endures. On the morning of June 3, 2016, the phone calls started before sunrise. They moved across time zones the way grief does. Unstoppable, indiscriminate, finding people in their kitchens, in their cars, in their offices, delivering the same 4 words, Muhammad Ali is gone. And then a pause. Not the pause of shock exactly, because the world had known this was coming, had known it for years, had watched the Parkinsons tighten its grip decade by decade. It was more the pause of a person who has been bracing for a door to close and still somehow flinches at the sound of it. He was 74 years old. Louisville moved first. The city that had once refused him a seat at a lunch counter began draping itself in mourning almost immediately. Flags came down. Murals appeared overnight. Spray paint and grief combined into something urgent and beautiful on the sides of buildings. People who had never laced up a boxing glove in their lives stood on sidewalks and cried in a way they couldn't entirely explain, which is actually the truest kind of crying. And the ones who could explain it said something like, "He made us feel like standing up was possible." The ones who couldn't just stood there, which said the same thing. The funeral procession through Louisville drew hundreds of thousands of people into the streets. They pressed against barriers and climbed lampposts and held up hand-painted signs. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Old men in church hats wept without embarrassment. The route wound past his childhood neighborhood, past the places that had shaped him and the places that had tried to break him, and it felt less like a goodbye and more like a homecoming with the guest of honor riding in silence for once. For a man who had never in his life shut up, gloriously, magnificently, purposefully never shut up, The quiet was almost funny. Almost. You half expected the motorcade to stop and a window to roll down and that voice to boom out one last prediction. It didn't, but you could feel what it would have sounded like. Tributes arrived from every direction a human being can receive a tribute from. Presidents and prime ministers, kings and poets, athletes and musicians, and ordinary people who had simply grown up watching him and absorbing, without always knowing it, the lesson he was teaching. Barack Obama wrote that Ali shook up the world, and the world is better for it. Lennox Lewis called him the reason he put on gloves. A man in Nairobi told a reporter that Ali was the first person who ever made him feel that black was not just acceptable, but magnificent. That last one lands differently than the presidential statement somehow. Not more important, just more naked in what it reveals about the reach of the man's life. What is extraordinary is how many different people claimed him. Conservatives and radicals, Muslims and Christians, athletes and pacifists, people who loved him for the boxing, people who had never cared about boxing but cared enormously about what he did outside the ring, people who disagreed with almost everything he'd ever said publicly and loved him anyway because they sensed something in him that was simply too alive to argue with. He was a Rorschach test with a left jab, and almost everyone who looked at him saw something worth admiring. The service itself was held at the KFC Yum Center in Louisville, a detail Ali would have found either deeply funny or deeply Louisvillian, probably both, and it was attended by dignitaries and champions and thousands of ordinary people who had simply shown up because where else would you be? Rabbi Michael Lerner spoke. Lonnie Ali, his wife of 30 years, spoke with the steady composure of a woman who had spent 3 decades being both partner and protector to a legend, and who understood better than anyone in that room the difference between the public Ali and the private one, the one who got tired, the one who had hard days, the one who sat quietly sometimes and simply was a man. That man was worth grieving too. Billy Crystal delivered a eulogy that made the enormous arena laugh and then pulled the laughter straight into sorrow, which is the only acceptable way to send off someone who spent his life doing exactly that. He recalled Ali's humor, the needle, the timing, the way the man could reduce a room to helplessness and then flip it without warning into something profound. Ali had always understood that comedy and courage share a skeleton. Both require you to stand in front of people and refuse to flinch. Beyond the ceremony, beyond the procession, the larger question was already forming. What does it mean, what he left behind? The answer is not simple, and Ali would have been suspicious of simple answers. He was a man who changed the way Black Americans talked about themselves in public, who demonstrated that defiance of power could be stylish and strategic and joyful, who proved that an athlete could carry moral weight without buckling under it. He paid for that proof in ways that compound interest doesn't cover. Years of his athletic prime, the constant surveillance, the death threats, the isolation of exile, and then the long, slow reckoning with a body that had given everything. But he bore it without becoming bitter, which might be the most remarkable thing, not without pain, with pain. The distinction matters enormously. The legacy burns because it is not a monument. Monuments are static. What Ali left is more like an argument still being made. That principle is not a luxury. That identity is not something other people get to assign you. That the loudest voice in the room is not always the most powerful one. And that sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is simply refuse. Refuse to go. Refuse to be quiet. Refuse to become smaller so that someone else can feel larger. The world has a tendency to sand down its great figures over time, to round off the edges until they fit nicely onto a commemorative stamp. It has tried, periodically, to do this to Muhammad Ali, to keep the butterfly and forget the sting. But the record resists it, the footage resists it. His own words, preserved in 10,000 recordings, resist it with every syllable. He said he was the greatest. He wasn't wrong. And on that June morning when the phone calls moved across the time zones, the reason people flinched, the reason the pause lasted as long as it did, was not simply that they had lost a champion. It was that they understood in the sudden, vertiginous way you understand things at moments of real loss, that they had been living in a world that contained Muhammad Ali, and now they would have to figure out how to live in the one that came after. That world is still working on it. One life, one story, infinite lessons. Subscribe, the next one drops soon, and trust me, you'll want to be there.